In our lifetime, most people, about 80-85% of the world, will experience what we call a trauma. Let's talk about it. This might be slightly controversial, but what if I told you that all of the symptoms of PTSD are normal? It's actually not that controversial. It's actually just true. All of the symptoms of PTSD, whether it is flashbacks, whether it's nightmares, whether it's intrusive thoughts or images, whether it's difficulty concentrating or sleeping, or your views on how you look at yourself, other people in the world changing, changes in your mood. All of these things, initially, post trauma, are normal. They're normal because this is how our mind and our body is trying to process this extremely stressful thing that just happened. So, traumas aren't necessarily like other memories. They are stronger than regular memories. It's very hard for our mind to process this memory that seems so different than other memories that maybe we've had before. So our mind starts going through this process, which is not fun, mind you, of trying to put this memory in its place with all the rest of the memories. And it's going to try this however it can. Whether it has to wait until you go to sleep to try it, or you just start thinking about it whenever you don't want to. That is your mind trying to put this trauma in its place so that you can move on and continue to function. Some experts will say that trauma-related nightmares are just our brain trying to process the trauma while we're sleeping. The only time maybe when we're not avoiding. It's not even until after 30 days post-trauma that you can even clinically be diagnosed with PTSD. And that's because a lot of these symptoms are normal ways of our mind processing a trauma. And often, if our mind does have the ability to process this trauma, people will not develop PTSD. When these symptoms start persisting months after, years after, decades after, that's when we have to take a different approach. But I would argue that the approach is very similar to if you were to do it a week after the trauma. If you're getting value from this content, go ahead and click that like button. Or better than that, share this video with another veteran. Most PTSD treatment protocols involve you moving closer to the trauma. No longer avoiding the trauma, but actually consciously and intentionally going towards it. One of the theories on why PTSD develops is that we get in the way of that trauma naturally getting processed. And how we do that is we do this thing called avoiding. Instead of looking at the trauma, instead of thinking about the trauma, instead of feeling some of those very difficult emotions that are connected to the trauma, we look away. That's the last thing often somebody wants to do. But what they end up doing is they get in the way of that very natural process of a trauma processing itself, so it can become just another memory. Now, it's still going to be a bad memory, but one that you don't have to look at every day of your life. But here's the reality here. Who wants to revisit potentially the worst time in their life? The answer is no one. So often, what we end up doing is we end up avoiding anything that is potentially connected to the trauma. Anything that reminds us of the trauma. Anything that smells like, tastes like, sounds like, feels like the trauma. That's the last thing that we want to get close to. This does a couple of things. One, on paper, it makes perfect sense. It feels safer. We feel like we're protecting ourselves. And at the same time, we are postponing a very natural process to take place. So part of PTSD treatment is not just learning new skills, but it's learning how to get out of the way. If you watched any of my content before, you know that I talk a lot about avoidance. And I talk about it as kind of the core symptom of PTSD. Not flashbacks, not nightmares, not intrusive images. But avoidance is one of the most common symptoms and part of the criteria of PTSD that anyone ends up having after a trauma. As I said earlier, the last thing that somebody wants to do is revisit the worst time in their life. Whether that is revisiting internal things such as thoughts and emotions, or it's avoiding certain people, places, situations, conversations. Maybe it's both. For my veteran population that's watching this video, there's another piece of avoidance that's often laid on top. And that's one, the stereotypes about seeking mental health and just struggling in general. Well, that will help somebody avoid even more. When you belong or are a part of a culture that says, well, pain is just part of the job, or pain equals weakness, or you're going to be a sick bay commando, well, then you have even more fuel to avoid, to not work on this trauma. This isn't just veterans, though. There are a lot of cultures out there that frown on mental health care, frown on even struggling, even though we all struggle. So there are many reasons why people continue to avoid and continue to not work on their PTSD or their trauma. So I don't want you to throw yourself under the bus for maybe getting in the way from time to time. But it is something to think about of, are you potentially getting in the way of actually moving forward with your life and not having to think about this trauma for the rest of your days? If you are interested in looking at your trauma a little bit closely, I suggest that you contact a mental health provider so they can walk you through the process. Especially if it's been a while since the trauma happened. Because here's what happens with avoidance. The longer that we avoid a trauma, the better we get at it. So we can reshape our entire lives around avoiding triggers of the trauma. And as you begin to not have to do those things anymore, you get more control over not just your trauma and your PTSD symptoms, but more control over your life. Something to think about. If this video was helpful for you, and I hope that it was, please like it or consider subscribing to my channel if you want to learn more about mental health. But more important than that, if this video is helpful for you, then that means it can probably be helpful for another veteran or another service member. So I ask that you share it with them, because at the end of the day, that's really what all this is about. One veteran trying to help another.